I didn't realize my son's recovery party for me would be an audition for my own disappearance. The invitation sounded loving, gentle even, but it tasted like metal the moment I heard his voice. By midnight, I would learn what family means when love is priced in signatures and champagne flutes. If you're watching this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching from. Let me tell you how it all started. The call came just after noon, when the sun threw polite rectangles across my kitchen table and the kettle fussed toward a simmer. "Mom," Daniel said, warm the way a salesman's smile is warm, "we're hosting something small tonight, just close friends, to celebrate your good news." My surgeon had cleared me last week. The hip that had nagged like a rude neighbor finally behaved, and I'd been walking circles around the living room as if each lap were a small rebellion against time. I'm 62, old enough to know the difference between affection and performance, and still foolish enough to pretend I don't. Daniel promised they'd keep it intimate, his word, at my old house, which now belongs to him on paper and to me in the 1,000 fingerprints of memory. Ava, his wife, chimed in on speaker to say she'd made my favorite lemon tart and that she had a little surprise planned, the way people say surprise when they mean control. I told them I'd be there. After we hung up, I kept holding the phone, as if it might apologize for what it had just carried into my kitchen. Silence has a texture when you're alone. That afternoon it felt like silk hiding a blade. I brewed tea I didn't drink and told myself not to be dramatic, as if intuition were a hobby I should put away when company comes. I spent the afternoon getting ready with the care of a woman who knows presentation buys a few seconds of grace. I steamed the navy dress Robert loved because it makes your eyes behave like storm glass, pinned back my hair, and slipped the emerald ring into place, a ring purchased during a summer so bright it makes my ribs ache to remember. The mirror returned a face that still knew where to aim her lipstick and where to hide the tremble, a grandmother who bakes on Sundays and keeps her accounts in a battered ledger with neat columns. Robert has been gone 3 years, but the habit of wanting to make him proud remains, a soft superstition I can't unteach my hands. I laid the invitation on the dresser and read the embossed words again as if they might change while I blinked. "Celebration of recovery," it said, in a font that knows the price of flowers by heart. I told myself this would be good for Daniel, good for us, a way to fold the family back into something that looked like a table instead of a chessboard. And yet an hour before I left, I stood in the doorway of the spare room, the room where his crib had once rattled with bad dreams, and felt the air shift, as if the house were whispering that I should keep my keys in my pocket. Age doesn't make you fearful, it makes you reverent toward the warnings you once ignored. So I tucked a small notebook into my purse, the one with lined pages that scold you into straight thinking, and I wrote one sentence: "If anything feels wrong, believe it." A courier dropped an envelope just before dusk, heavy paper, my name looped in gold, the kind of flourish money buys when sincerity is low on inventory. Inside was a program: 8:15 toast, 8:30 candle moment, 9 o'clock photo wall, and a note in Ava's precise hand: "Can't wait to celebrate you." So many people who love you want to say a few words. There was a PS, smaller: "We'll also take care of some tiny formalities to keep things simple after surgery." It was the sort of sentence that smiles while patting your shoulder, the way bankers do when they're about to slide a stack of forms across the desk. I phoned Daniel to ask about it, and he laughed too quickly, saying it was just housekeeping and that I shouldn't worry my pretty head, his words, not mine, as if prettiness were a leash. "We want everything easy for you, Mom," he said, "no more fuss with papers." I thought about the papers I have spent a lifetime learning to understand, about the contracts I'd signed and the wills Robert and I had revised after his second heart scare, and a small, stubborn heat rose in my chest. Still, I told him I trusted him, because mothers keep trying to turn their children back into boys who bring home drawings. When the car service texted that it was waiting, I snapped my purse shut and reached for my shawl. That's when another message arrived from an unknown number, delivered like a stone tossed through glass. Make sure she drinks the first toast. The doctor is ready for tomorrow. The driver left me at the edge of the old street, the one where lamplight leaned too close to the pavement, as if it wanted to overhear secrets. I stood for a moment with my shawl clutched tighter than modesty required, watching the windows of my former house glow as if the bricks themselves were rehearsing joy. Cars lined the curb, laughter carried across the hedges, brittle as glassware. I hadn't been inside that home in nearly 3 years, not since I signed it over to Daniel with the belief that love outweighed paperwork. Tonight it looked like a theater, the curtains drawn back for an act I hadn't auditioned for. I whispered Robert's name under my breath, a talisman against the dread that was pulling threads through my chest. Inside, the applause came too quickly, the kind of cheer that doesn't start in the eyes. Daniel hugged me, firm but brief, the way you hug an old colleague you need something from. Ava kissed the air near my cheek, leaving no mark but plenty of intention. The rooms brimmed with faces, some vaguely familiar, others perfect strangers, yet each looked at me like a performer they'd read about in the program. My photograph beamed from the mantel, larger than life, wreathed in flowers I hadn't chosen. I tried to match their warmth, nodding, smiling, though my pulse counted each second with suspicion. When Ava pressed a flute of champagne into my hand, I saw her eyes linger just a little too long to be affectionate. The evening unfolded in polite increments, conversations about my health, stories retold as if they belonged to someone else, laughter that sounded like it had been rented by the hour. Daniel clinked his glass and raised a toast to Mother's strength, her resilience, her second chance at life. Everyone cheered. I lifted my glass but let the liquid touch only my lips, not my throat. Across the room I noticed 2 men in tailored suits whispering while pointing toward me. When I shifted closer, their words brushed against my ears. By tomorrow she won't remember a thing. I froze, smile intact, as if plaster could keep my bones from rattling. Later, I excused myself to find the bathroom. The hallway was quieter, the air cooler. I steadied myself against the wallpaper and drew a slow breath, only to notice a small amber vial discarded in the trash beside the sink. The label was peeled, but I recognized enough: sedatives. My fingers trembled as I lifted the vial, the kind nurses warn you never to mix with alcohol. Suddenly the buzz of the party felt like an engine in the walls. I heard footsteps, voices threading closer, Daniel's low and insistent, Ava's sharp like cutlery. The doctor says she'll sign without realizing, he muttered. And if not, the rest vanished under the turn of the doorknob. I had only seconds to decide, confront them here and now or slip back into the performance, pretending I hadn't just heard the sentence that could end me. I eased the lock back into place and practiced the oldest survival trick a woman learns. I smoothed my dress, lifted my chin, and pretended I had heard nothing at all. The hallway noise swelled like surf as I stepped out, cameras clicking from someone's phone, a little chorus of "You look amazing," and over it all Ava's bright voice calling for one more toast for our miracle. She materialized with a fresh flute, the stem cold against my palm, her smile lacquered to perfection. Behind her, 2 men in the kind of suits that never sit down watched me with the appetite of auditors. Daniel stood at the piano, tapping his glass, telling our guests how brave I'd been, how grateful he was, how lucky we all were tonight. And I thought of the message from the unknown number and the sedative vial in the bathroom trash and understood that luck was something they expected to manage on paper. I held the glass to my lips and let the bubbles kiss my skin, then lowered it with an apologetic laugh about being on the gentle stuff after surgery, the kind of softness that never offends a crowd. When the room turned back to chatter, I folded my cocktail napkin over the rim and tilted, letting a whisper of liquid vanish like a secret, and set the glass down among a garden of identical flutes. A server swooped, gathered, and the problem became somebody else's, but I kept my eyes on Ava, whose fingers closed around a glass too quickly for coincidence. If the plan required me to be foggy, someone was about to become the weather instead. The thought steadied me more than the canapés ever could. They had built the evening like an exhibit and moved me through it the way museums shepherd schoolchildren, a photo wall for the smiling, a memory corner for the sentimental, and, tucked near the library doors, a little table laid out like a desk at a bank. A neat stack of forms waited there beside a fountain pen and a portable scanner, with a tasteful sign that read "Convenience Station," as if convenience were a sacrament. Daniel shepherded me toward it with the careful hands of a stage manager and introduced a woman with a severe bob as Linda, helping us with the logistics, which is how people in my son's world pronounce the word liability. Another man materialized at my elbow in an expensive sweater that tried too hard to be casual. He offered a card that read Dr. Lyle Keating, Geriatric Medicine, and told me he'd volunteered to pop by and make sure my recovery was progressing beautifully. I smiled sweetly and asked if the house now had revolving doors. He chuckled, then produced a laminated sheet and asked if I'd humor him with a quick cognitive screen, just standard after anesthesia. He wanted me to draw a clock at 11:10, then to remember 3 words, then to count backward by sevens, and I obliged with the patience of a schoolteacher who has already graded the test key. When he wrote 86 after 93, I took the pen and corrected the math the way Robert used to correct the deckhand who thought knots were suggestions. The suits watched, Ava's smile tightened, Daniel shifted, just enough to tell me the rehearsal had not included my competence. Linda slid the first document into view with the tenderness of a midwife. "Nothing heavy," she purred, "just streamlining, house title clarifications, power of attorney updates, medical proxies, so you never have to fuss with files again." I adjusted my glasses and read the headers. Quitclaim deed regarding the property I still set the table for on holidays, durable power of attorney naming Daniel as absolute agent, healthcare proxy with language so broad it could swallow a person in their sleep. In the corner of each page a watermark glowed like a bruise, Mercer and Vale, the firm I remember because their senior partner once flirted with me at a charity auction while his wife examined the silver. "Do you mind if I take 5 minutes to read?" I asked, in the tone of a woman more concerned with punctuation than implication, and Linda fluttered about how of course, they wanted me comfortable. "Then I'll need water and bread," I said, looking the doctor in the eye. "My surgeon insists on it with the meds." He hesitated, only a bead of it, but a server brought both, and I chewed deliberately, forcing the sharpness back into my edges. In the margin of the proxy I found a little clause that would allow hospital admission without my consent if the agent observes confusion, and I heard the echo of the bathroom voices. "The doctor is ready for tomorrow." I lifted my head and caught Ava's reflection in the glass of the bookcase, watching me the way a cat watches a canary flirt with its caged door. I set the papers down and told Daniel I'd like to wash my hands before I sign, because mothers do ask permission even in their own tragedies, and because I needed 30 seconds with a door that locked. The study still smelled faintly of Robert's pipe tobacco, a fragrance that arrives like a ghost to apologize for not dying with the man. The leather chair had been replaced by something large and lifeless, but the desk, my desk, if memory has any say, was arranged with a precision that made my skin prickle. A thin blue folder labeled Continuity Plan, waited beside a legal pad covered in someone else's careful handwriting. Beneath it I found a checklist with 3 boxes already ticked: social narrative established, preliminary witnesses prepped, medication secured. Tucked deeper was a printed capacity declaration with my name pre-filled and a blank line where Dr. Keating's signature would live, along with a Sunrise Harbor Care admission packet that helpfully printed tomorrow's date at 9 a.m. as though fate kept office hours. I slipped my little notebook from my purse and copied names, firms, dates, the room bright with the quiet fury that keeps widows upright at midnight. A flash drive lay beside the keyboard, its label written in Ava's precise hand, backups, photos and logs. I slid it into my shawl's hidden pocket because some things a grandmother learns from raising a boy who loved to borrow radios. Footsteps came down the hall, unhurried and assured, and the doorknob turned with the familiarity of someone who cannot imagine a door in this house resisting him. Daniel stepped in, closing the world behind him with a gentle click, and leaned his weight against the wood as if it belonged to him more than the bones in his own hands. He did not look at the papers, he looked at me, and for a moment his throat moved with the effort of finding a version of his mother who would accept the story they had written. "Mom," he said softly, "this is safer for everyone. Sign them tonight, rest tonight, and tomorrow will be easy." Ava slipped in behind him with a velvet case that wasn't jewelry and a smile that never learned sorrow. Two witnesses edged into the doorway like punctuation marks that make a sentence a verdict. I straightened, not because I felt brave, but because I still know how to look like someone with say over the weather. Daniel reached for the pen. Ava opened the case. And when the needle lifted and pricked the air between us, I understood that the signature they wanted most was my pulse. The needle winked in the lamplight, a silver hyphen between the sentence they wanted me to sign and the period they meant to put at the end of me, and in that thinnest slice of a second I did what old women in nice dresses have done for centuries to stay alive. I made everybody comfortable. I softened my shoulders, let my voice find the oiled hush I used on bankers when Robert was alive, and said I'd be grateful for a seat by better light because my hip still complained in certain chairs. I asked Dr. Keating, so courteous, so credentialed, to humor an old superstition and wash his hands again, for luck, while I dabbed at my wrist with a linen square and smiled as if I had not seen the Sunrise Harbor admission packet peeking from under the continuity plan. When Ava moved closer with her velvet case, I turned slightly so she had to pivot, and in that turn I watched her blink just a fraction too slow, a sheen of heat along her hairline, the faintest tremble in the hand holding the cap, signs I recognized from every pre-op pamphlet that warned about sedatives and champagne being poor companions. I let the moment breathe. I praised her earrings. I asked whether the jeweler on Newberry still did hand engraving because I'd told Daniel years ago that initials were not ownership but memory, and while her mouth formed a polite answer her grip adjusted, a small correction made by someone whose horizon had tilted without her noticing. Daniel set the forms down in a fan the way he used to lay out comic books to make me choose one, and for a heartbeat I saw the boy who once believed a mother could cure everything with a sandwich. Then the fan became paper teeth and I remembered the text that had landed like a stone in my kitchen, "Make sure she drinks the first toast," and felt the old house narrow around us like a throat. "Before we begin," I said, "I'd like to be sure we all understood Dr. Keating's arithmetic," and I let a smile play at the edge of my mouth as I wrote 79 beneath his 86 and drew a careful arrow back to 93, an elementary correction delivered in the tone of a dessert recipe. He flushed the way men do when their authority springs a leak. Linda murmured that the test was informal, which is cousin to falsifiable, and I turned the proxy to the lamp so its bruise-colored watermark showed like a fingerprint left on a conscience. "This clause," I asked sweetly, tapping the sentence that allowed involuntary admission upon an agent's mere observation of confusion, "do you prefer that before or after the quitclaim?" Dr. Keating's pupils tried to decide whether I was canvas or knife, and in that half-second Ava's hand betrayed her. The cap clicked against the needle at the wrong angle, the tiniest chime of metal on metal, and a clear tear of liquid welled at the tip and fell onto her wrist. She hissed a word her pearls wouldn't say in public and steadied herself on the desk edge, and I smelled the acrid ghost of something that didn't care whether it slept in my veins or hers. "Careful," I told her softly, "weather changes quickly in old houses." Daniel laughed too loudly, a sound that bounced off the bookcases and came back thinner. He told me I was being dramatic, told me everyone here only wanted me comfortable, told me fear makes people misread kindness, and while he told me that, he turned the durable power so the signature line kissed my side of the world and slid the pen toward my fingers as if it were a glass of water offered to someone whose throat had already closed. I picked up the pen because sometimes survival wears agreement like a shawl, and I asked for my reading glasses because the print was the kind of small reserved for those who don't intend for you to read, and I opened my handbag as slowly as a prayer until Daniel's eyes dropped to the purse with the instinct of a man tracking a threat he cannot name. The flash drive's weight warmed against my arm where I'd hidden it, that little bone of truth pocketed from a desk now pretending to be his. And when I didn't find the glasses I sighed and said I must have left them near the piano where he'd been so eloquent about my resilience. Perhaps we could sign in the library under the chandelier, where even false light is honest about what it wants. He didn't like moving the scene, stage managers seldom do, so Linda chirped about ambience and the doctor agreed that environmental familiarity improves cognition, the way men in suits agree with anything that keeps the machinery humming, and we threaded back through the hall with me between Daniel and his wife like a procession carrying a relic too delicate for the front steps. As we passed the mirror I saw Ava's reflection hesitate, a minute shudder in her smile, the sedative lying to her about how far the floor was. She tightened her fingers on the velvet case, and the needle, now capped askew, winked at me like a gossip. In the library the little bank table waited with its pen and portable scanner and the white napkins stacked like surrender flags, and from the ballroom a muffled voice called something about the program, about candles at past, and somewhere a caterer laughed the bright laugh of a person who isn't paid to notice context. I sat. I put the pen to the page, and I wrote my name with the neat deliberation of a woman who learned long ago that handwriting is a form of weather. Then I paused at the flourish and asked Daniel whether the date would be today or the one printed on the pre-filled Sunrise Harbor packet I'd seen a moment ago. The room held its breath, and then the house answered for us. The lights went out on cue, the way a stage manager snaps darkness into being, and the candle moment arrived like a tidal cut in a tidal river, swift, rehearsed, and absolute. There was a rustle of matches beyond the doorway, a communal 100 little flares painting the hall with warm excuses, and in that curated dark a hand found my wrist with the intimacy of a promise. The cap scraped away in the hush, soft plastic against sharper truth, and somewhere to my left Ava exhaled a low, animal sound that told me the room was not the only thing growing dim. I turned my face toward where I knew Daniel's certainty would be and said his name in the tone I used when he was 6 and tried to tell me the cookie jar had fallen on its own, and his fingers tightened until the old fracture in my forearm whispered its winter ache. "Sign," he breathed, and in the second he leaned for the page the needle kissed the inside of my arm, not breaking skin but learning the map. And the chandelier above us flared back to life just in time for every guest in the doorway with their sweet little tapers to see my son's shadow bent over me like a man trying to find a vein. When the lights snapped back, the room did what crowds always do when truth arrives uninvited. It blinked, then pretended it had been looking all along. 100 candle flames wobbled as people realized the tableau they'd walked in on. My son bent over my wrist, a doctor poised with a needle that did not belong to celebration, me very still in a chair that used to be mine. I leaned into the hush the way a diver leans into water. "How thoughtful," I said brightly, letting my voice carry to the doorway, a live demonstration of after-surgery care for our guests. A few awkward chuckles stumbled out, the kind you hear at funerals when someone mentions weather. Daniel straightened too fast, knocking the pen, and Dr. Keating stepped back with the helpless smile of a man who's discovered his stage has mirrors. "Vitamin support," he offered, wagging the needle like a pointer. "Though I generally prefer consent before the lecture," I answered, glancing at the amber tear still clinging to the steel. "What's in it, doctor? Anything festive you recommend mixing with champagne?" Ava's laugh arrived late and brittle, and I watched the smallest flinch cross her face as if her horizon had shifted half a degree. "Air," I said, fanning myself lightly with the proxy as if it were a church program. "This old heart still believes in oxygen." The suggestion let the crowd breathe. People stepped aside, murmuring, and I stood with the careful effort of a woman who has learned to rise while someone is trying to make her sit. I drifted toward the French doors and the terrace, not fleeing so much as inviting a procession, and the procession obliged because people follow a center of gravity even when it's wearing pearls. Daniel moved to flank me. Ava matched pace with a smile stretched thin as ribbon. "We can finalize the tiny formalities at the convenience station," Linda chirped, trotting behind with her portable scanner like a bellboy who takes tips and signatures. "Of course," I said, "but I'd love to redo the little cognitive warm-up where the good doctor miscounted by sevens." "For fun." A ripple passed through the nearest cluster. Someone whispered miscounted, the way people whisper termite. "It was informal," Keating said, heat rising in his neck. "Informal arithmetic is a charming specialty," I replied, though I prefer my numbers sober. On the terrace the night smelled of lilacs and wet stone and other honest things. Candles found tabletops, glasses found hands, the pianist found a waltz that didn't deserve what it was accompanying. I let the proxy droop visibly and read the clause aloud in a voice sweet enough to frost the edges. "Agent may authorize hospital admission upon mere observation of confusion." Some guests blinked hard. One woman, Margot from the museum board, who has been suing people for sport since 1998, tilted her head the way a hawk tilts at wrestling. "That isn't standard," she said to no one and everyone. "Especially paired with a durable power." I smiled as if she'd reminded me to bring a sweater. "You hear that, Daniel? Even Margot prefers sweaters to straitjackets." Ava's hand brushed my elbow, gentle, guiding, and trembled just enough to tell me that whatever had kissed her skin earlier was beginning to hum. "Careful," I murmured, and dabbed at her wrist with my linen square, grandmotherly as a hymn. Someone's had too much generosity. I asked for the microphone they'd set for toasts, and it came, because what child tells his mother no in public unless he's forgotten the language? "Thank you all for celebrating a second chance," I began, and a chorus of conditioned approval rolled back toward the house. "I'm told there's also a little table for streamlining life, which is a lovely idea. But I have always believed streamlining tastes better with witnesses." Laughter found itself again. I held up the deed packet, fluttered the pages like a magician who intends to produce a dove, and laid them flat where every camera phone could perform its conscience. "Doctor, would you explain, plainly, why a recovery party requires a syringe and a capacity declaration pre-filled with tomorrow's date?" The question landed like a dish on a tile floor. No shatter yet, just the promise. Keating cleared his throat and said something about post-operative vitamin therapy and precautionary templates, but Margot was already scrolling through a case on her phone, and an older man in a navy blazer muttered, "Templates don't carry watermarks from Mercer and Vail." "They do when convenience is a sacrament," I said, almost kindly, and slid the health proxy back across the linen, writing in slow, tidy letters above the signature line, "I decline and request independent counsel." Cameras drink the sentence the way parched things drink shade. Daniel tried to pivot, as men do when floors tilt. "Mom," he said loud enough to recruit sympathy, "this is to make things easier for you. We worry." He looked almost persuasive, tall, handsome, the kind of son who sells calendars for charity and gets printed on them. I let the ache of him rise and pass like weather. Then worry out loud, I said, with the lights on. I turned to the guests, neighbors, donors, ancient friends who remember what I looked like before grief took a seam ripper to my face. If I am ever confused, let me tell you now, it will be about why men with needles arrive before cake. A soft wave of agreement rose, timid but real. Ava stepped closer to reclaim the narrative and the pen. The velvet case clicked open, and with it came the thin, medicinal breath that had warned me in the study. Her eyes widened the way windows widen when a storm announces itself from inside the room. She reached for the table to steady a world that had changed temperature without warning. Her glass tipped, chimed against another, and the candles caught the tremor racing through her wrist. "Sit," I said, the syllable carrying the old authority of mothers who survive by giving orders. Ava smiled, obedient on reflex, and then her knees simply forgot the choreography. The needle case slid from her fingers like a fish escaping a careless hand. Daniel lunged to catch his wife and in doing so revealed the admission bracelet tucked in his inside pocket, white plastic, my name embossed like a scheduled weather event, tomorrow's date winking up at the terrace lights. A collective intake of breath, the sound human beings make when the script malfunctions, swept the tables. Linda shuffled the papers, faster now, the portable scanner chirping like a frightened bird. Dr. Keating half-crouched where Ava was sinking, mouth forming a diagnosis that would taste like apology later. I took one step back, not out of fear but to widen the angle in every watching eye. "Careful," I said again, softer, as the bracelet glinted and the case lay open and the room finally saw the outline I'd been tracing. And then, from the front hall, a sharp knock rammed itself through the music, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission because it arrived already holding it. The knock came again, not the polite fingertip of a neighbor but the flat-palmed certainty of somebody carrying paperwork, and when the door opened the house inhaled two men in dark uniforms pushing a collapsible gurney that squeaked like a confession. Their jackets said medical transport in block letters that wanted to be law from a distance. One held a clipboard already populated with my name, tomorrow's date, and the facility I had seen pre-printed on the admission packet that pretended to be a courtesy. "Evening, ma'am," the older one said, warm like a space heater. "We've got orders to assist with a safe wellness transfer after recent surgery. Just a precaution, signed and countersigned." He didn't say by whom. He didn't need to while Dr. Keating hovered with his damp authority and Daniel's jaw found the angle men use when they intend to look reasonable while removing your choices. Ava, pale and shining, tried to stand straighter beside the table, and the needle case winked near her elbow like a bad idea with perfect posture. Around us, the guests redistributed themselves into witnesses, the way people do when they feel the floor change but haven't decided which way nobility is. I folded my hands over the proxy and smiled at the transport lead, the smile I used on headmasters when Daniel was 8 and a teacher mistook stubbornness for malice. "Before we practice safety," I said, "let's all practice clarity. Whose signature authorizes this, and what is the chemical name of the comfort in that syringe?" The older man's eyes slid to the clipboard, to the doctor, to my son. The answer that returned wore 3 faces and no name. I gave the room what anxiety denies people most: instructions. "Friends," I said into the microphone still warm from the toast, "would you help me with a tiny experiment? I'll recite tonight's date, the street address of this house, the mayor's name, and my granddaughter's birthday, and then we'll let Dr. Keating demonstrate math by 7s without scenery." I did it slowly and clearly, letting memory climb into the light like a cat onto a sun-warmed sill, and a polite rustle of approval followed, the kind that makes a certain breed of professional sweat above the collar. "Now, doctor," I added, What dosage were you proposing for an old woman with a repaired hip and a documented allergy to benzodiazepines? He opened his mouth, and then his medical transport answered for him with the weary bravado of men who have strapped many inconvenient grandmothers to many tidy gurneys. "We don't carry benzodiazepines," the younger one said, and I nodded, because the vial scent on Ava's wrist pronounced the lie for me. Margot from the museum board lifted her phone like a chalice and took a photograph of the proxy clause in the candlelight, reading it aloud so the words could smell their own meaning. The older man, feeling the floor tilt under the cameras, shifted tactics to kindness and placed 2 fingers against his badge like an oath. "Ma'am, we'd like to do this gently. The order is valid tonight." "The order is hungry tonight," I corrected, and set my palm flat on the papers as if the table were a small animal I could calm by touch. Daniel stepped forward with that hands up, palms out posture men rehearse in mirrors when they plan to rewrite a woman's fear as melodrama, and he spoke as if coaxing a cat down from a tree he had secretly shaken. "Mom, please, this is about avoiding complications. You'll be home in the morning after some observation." He almost convinced the part of me that still buys lemonade from children who never drink their own product, and I let that tenderness move through me so that when I answered I could mean it. "Observation," I said, "happens with eyes, not restraints." Then I picked up my water and tipped it, careless as age allows, across the continuity plan so ink bled into a small night sky and the portable scanner chirped its indignation into the hush. Ava swayed at the sound, caught herself on the edge of the table, and I saw the tiny smudge where the needle's tear had kissed her skin bloom to a faint rose. "Daniel," I said softly so only he could hear, "whatever was in that case is working on your wife now. Be careful what storms you schedule for someone else's horizon." His mouth tightened, he reached for my elbow, the older transport man reached for the strap, the younger one reached for the pen that would make me freight. Somewhere near the door a nervous laugh spilled into the hall and ran back to the kitchen like water seeking downhill. I turned my face to the room again because privacy is where bullies grow and I have retired from making them comfortable. "I will not be transferred anywhere without independent counsel present," I said, and my voice found that old timbre Robert used when a contractor tried to charge twice for the same staircase. "Anyone here who has ever signed something they did not read is welcome to forgive me by leaving. The rest might wish to watch." It wasn't a threat, it was an invitation, and people prefer those. Margot sidled closer like a prosecutor at a buffet and asked the transport to name the statutory code authorizing a night of party extraction. He answered with the alphabet the way men do when their training manual has more tabs than facts. A neighbor I barely recognized, a public defender with the posture of a question mark, raised her hand as if we were choosing desserts and said she would be delighted to call a judge she disliked and an editor she didn't. And 2 donors in navy blazers repositioned themselves to block the gurney's wheels with the naturalness of men tuning a sail. Dr. Keating tried to reassert narrative by lifting the needle as if it were a conductor's baton and saying something about gentle sedation for transport, but the younger medic's glance betrayed irritation. However bad he was at law, he knew optics when they were strangling him. Daniel's voice lowered to that hiss people use when they think microphones are decorations. He reminded me of hospital bills I had paid, of birthdays he remembered, of the baby pictures that live in my wallet. And then he said the sentence that stripped the varnish from the night, "You owe us trust." I looked at his hand on my arm, at the bracelet in his pocket with my name embossed in cheap plastic, and decided that debt was an invention like confetti, pretty, not binding. The older transport man cleared his throat, put 2 fingers to his earpiece, and nodded to nobody I could see, then tightened his grip on the strap. From the foyer came the authoritative bark of a new voice and a third knock, harder and colder, shattering the chandelier's patience. "Police, open the door." They came in like weather, not men, two uniforms in navy with the square shoulders of certainty and the clipped syllables of people who expect doors to behave. Badges flashed, a body camera blinked its red, a patient heartbeat, and the older one announced a welfare check initiated by a physician's report of cognitive decline paired with possible self-harm, the kind of phrasing that slides past hospitality and goes straight for custody. I lifted my chin and asked for names and badge numbers, asked whether the body cams were running, asked if either of them would like a glass of water before they told an old woman in front of her neighbors that she was an emergency, and the older one answered Sergeant Vance, ma'am, while the younger one, so knew his haircut still had instructions, said Officer Delgado, and read my name off a form that had tomorrow's date already typed into the space meant for events. The medical transport eased their gurney forward like a ship testing a dock. Dr. Keating held his needle low, pretending it was an afterthought. Linda hovered with her portable scanner, which chirped the way small animals do when they recognize a larger mouth. Daniel stepped into the triangle between me and the officers with his palms tilted toward reason, telling them about my surgery, my memory lapses, how I'd wandered after sunset last week and called the lamp in my kitchen a stranger. A story so tidy I could see the folder tab from here. "We'll do this the easy way," Vance said, and I said the easy way looked suspiciously like the profitable way, and then I asked if I could demonstrate competence by naming the governor, the year Robert died, the bank that held my original trust, and the difference between subtraction and seduction, which is that one takes away and the other pretends not to. Delgado's mouth twitched, Margot's phone recorded, someone coughed into a linen napkin as if etiquette could absorb a plan. I spread the proxy on the table and read aloud the clause about admission upon mere observation of confusion, then pointed to the admission bracelet winking white in Daniel's pocket, my name spelled correctly for once, and the room made a soft sound like silk tearing where a seam has been holding too long. Vance's eyes moved to Keating's hands. I followed them with the kind of smile I reserve for men who forget that women keep track. "For the record," I said into the camera that was the whole evening, "I am allergic to benzodiazepines. Does anyone here propose to test which truth kills me faster?" Ava chose that moment to sway, which is to say the product finally met the promise. Her knuckles whitened against the table edge, the needle case slipped in a graceful arc that would have made a dancer proud, and she tried to bless the carpet with the soles of her Louboutins while her eyes argued with gravity. For a beat the party did what parties do, froze in delight, because a fall is a story everyone understands, and then the younger medic reached her first and the doctor's voice jumped 2 registers into performance as he announced a vasovagal episode and requested space as if decorum were oxygen. I stepped aside because life has taught me the difference between spectacle and triage, and in that step I lifted the velvet case with 2 fingers, held it where the nearest camera could love it, and said very clearly that whatever kissed Ava's wrist earlier did not belong in mine. The room digested that like a hard almond. Daniel, panicked enough to forget the choreography, tried to pull me behind the gurney while telling the sergeant I'd tampered with his wife's drink on the terrace, and the speed with which he found that sentence told me it had been waiting in his pocket with the bracelet. Vance's attention split like good light, half to Ava's pulse, half to the paperwork, and he asked Keating to state the compound in the syringe and whether he'd logged its chain of custody, 2 phrases that do not sound convivial under chandeliers. Margot, dear vulture of righteousness, read aloud the watermark on the proxy, Mercer and Vale, and asked whether the house always hosted notarizations with champagne, which made 2 donors near the windows suddenly remember other appointments. Delgado whispered into his radio and received a reply that rearranged his posture into something skeptical. The body camera stared at me the way confessionals do when the line has been long and noon is past. I told Vance I would happily go to the station to make a recorded statement if his officers would first accept evidence of a planned involuntary transfer backed by forged proxies, a pre-printed hospital intake, and a doctor with arithmetic that hissed when held up to light. The sergeant took the velvet case because he had to. He asked the medic to read the contents of the vial. He asked Keating to step away from my skin. And then he asked Daniel, my son, what exactly capacity declaration, pre-signed, meant in his handwriting on the top sheet of the stack. The knight, insulted at last, did what knights do when truth exceeds their wattage. It dimmed to a hum while the house inhaled and waited to see whether the old woman would sink or float. Ava, propped against the table leg with a blood pressure cuff chewing her arm, found enough voice to point in my direction and tell the sergeant that I had always been unstable, that I drank more than doctors like, that grief had unstitched me in untidy ways, and then her pupils touched the edges of the room and slid. Daniel tried to clutch both narratives, devoted husband, responsible son, but the bracelet winked again and the proxy's bruise-colored claws dared him to blink, so he did what frightened people do. He pushed the blame where it would hurt least and survive longest. She poisoned my wife, he said, and the sentence leapt like a fish straight into the red circle of the camera. Keating nodded too eagerly. The medics glared at nobody, and for a heartbeat the entire party shared the same thought, which was that they were going to be in a story and wondered whether they would be cast as scenery or sin. I laughed, not to be cruel but because astonishment needed somewhere to put its hands, and then I named my necklace designer, the brand of Ava's perfume, the serial number scratched on the back of the portable scanner, and the date. Daniel changed the locks on this house and forgot to ask for my key. The laughter sifted into a hush that wasn't on their program. Vance rubbed a hand down his face and told everyone to lower their voices and keep their hands where cameras like them. He asked me to hand over the flash drive bulging my shawl and I did, because strategy is sometimes just timing with lipstick. And he asked Margot to stop narrating case law into her phone as if the law would applaud. Delgado's radio cracked with a new dispatch, and he turned his head the way men do when their idea of the evening has been invited to leave. The words that arrived did not belong to the party at all. "Sarge," he said, trying to keep his voice still, "Command just flagged a missing person bolo from earlier tonight. Same address, same doctor, different victim, birth mother, 17, last seen at a reproductive clinic outside the city." Daniel's hand closed on the edge of the deed packet and crushed the paper like a throat. Vance looked at me as if he was finally willing to consider that hurricanes can come dressed as mothers, then pivoted toward the medics and the doctor with a voice that belonged to mornings. "Everyone, stop moving." He stepped in, lifted my wrist gently as if checking for something delicate, and then turned his body camera so it stared straight at my face and said the line that sucked the oxygen out of the evening, "Margaret Harrison, you're under arrest for the attempted poisoning of Ava Rowe." They cuffed me gently, which is a particular kind of insult, the way a hotel apologizes for overbooking while handing you a key to a room with no windows, and the party split like a school of fish, half scattering to the kitchen and the other half to their phones as if the truth might look kinder through a screen. Sergeant Vance read the words I've heard on television my whole life and never expected to wear, and I nodded at each phrase as though it were a recipe I already knew by heart. Ava was lifted toward an ambulance in a lattice of concerned hands and practiced voices, her chin tilting like a flower that has learned the sun can be cruel. Daniel hovered above her, doing the math in the dead center of his face, calculating which grief would photograph best. As we moved through the foyer, the gurney men tried to make themselves furniture, and Dr. Keating tucked the needle into his pocket with a magician's shrug, but the body camera loved them all indiscriminately, catching the bracelet's white wink and the velvet case's shy gleam. On the stoop, Margot asked for the case number and provided me a lawyer's name in a voice that was church and cross-examination at once, and I thanked her with the dignity reserved for women who know how to return Pyrex dishes and favors on time. The ride to the station smelled of vinyl and yesterday's coffee and the kind of fatigue that makes men think they are the only thin wall between order and appetite. Officer Delgado sat forward with his hands around the steering wheel like a prayer, asking nothing, hearing everything. At booking, I removed my ring and my stubbornness and set them both in a gray plastic tray while a young officer with careful eyeliner inventoried the contents of a life that still fit in a handbag. I asked for water and was given a paper cup that seemed surprised by its own smallness, and when Vance offered coffee, I smiled at him the way I smile at stray dogs, grateful and unwilling to be bitten. My thumbprint bloomed on a screen that did not care. I used to dust flour from this same hand onto a counter where my son once sat swinging his legs and telling me jokes, and then the cell received me with a click that sounded exactly like an expensive pen closing. I sat on the bench, back straight because that is how I survived the 80s and other men, and breathed slowly until my pulse realized it wasn't a fire alarm. They brought me into an interview room that wore its honesty like bare bulbs, and Vance placed the flash drive I had given him on the table with the ceremony of a communion plate while Delgado arranged forms as if paper could be persuaded into ethics. The recorder light pricked awake, and my name became a file. I recounted the evening as if I were braiding hair, slow and tight and patient, starting with the embossed program and ending with the clause about mere observation of confusion. And each time the sergeant tried to skip ahead, I returned us to the point where the arithmetic failed because numbers are where stories confess. I told them about the Sunrise Harbor packet dated for tomorrow and the bracelet printed for a future I had not agreed to, and I said the words Mercer and Vale watermark with the calm of someone who once balanced a household ledger by hand while an empire glittered and miscounted in the next room. When Vance asked whether I had poisoned Ava, I said grief has many recipes but mine does not include sedatives, and when he asked whether I would submit to a blood draw, I said yes, on the condition that the chain of custody be read aloud and written down twice. He nodded, not because he liked me but because procedure is a rosary even cynics finger when storms push in from the east. I declined further questions until counsel arrived, and filled the silence with the delicate labor of readying my shawl, giving the room time to inhale all the ways the evening's theater had failed its audience. Delgado's radio chirped and whispered about patrol units still posted at the house and a neighbor who had uploaded a minute of lamplit footage in which a doctor with a needle looked like a man with a needle, and the young officer's mouth did a small, private thing. The shape skepticism makes before it learns to talk. The sergeant excused himself to check on talks, a phrase that sounded like hope with handcuffs on, and I was left with the taste of paper cups and the memory of Robert telling a contractor that shortcuts are just long cuts with postponement. When Vance returned, he carried only his face, but it held a weather change. Preliminary labs from the ambulance suggested benzodiazepines on Ava's skin in amounts inconsistent with oral ingestion, which is a competent way of saying the medicine arrived by a road that did not go through me. I allowed myself one slow breath and asked whether he had opened the flash drive, and he said property would process it by the hour's end, which was a sermon about patience I have heard since girlhood and never learned to love. The door opened to admit a clipboard and a woman in county beige who pronounced my last name correctly while asking whether I preferred tea, and I knew a ritual was ending and another was about to begin. It began with paper that smelled like toner and certainty, the kind of paper men raise like shields when they intend to call it mercy. Linda walked in wearing her severe bob and the same portable smile she'd used on the convenience table, flanked by two hospital lawyers who had never sweated in their lives, and set an emergency guardianship order on the table with a softness that asked you to forgive the bruise. The judge's signature rode the bottom margin like a storm line on a barometer, late night, ex parte, immediate effect, granting Daniel temporary authority over my medical decisions in the interest of safety, a phrase that can be taught to fetch whatever you throw. Vance's jaw tightened, the bureaucrat's pain of a man who has to bow to a document while his instincts are still untying their shoes. He checked the timestamp, checked the seal, checked the text again as if letters might agree to rearrange for him, then told me he was obligated to honor the transfer to Sunrise Harbor pending a competency hearing. Delgado stared at the order the way good men stare at things that will make them older. He started to speak and thought better of it, then began again to ask whether immediate enforcement was necessary given that talks on the alleged victim pointed away from me. And Linda's smile re-threaded itself into something that had been waiting for precisely that question. "Safety doesn't like to wait," she said, and behind her 2 uniformed private transports in fresh jackets rolled a gurney into a public building with the confidence of people who had paid to learn the trick of it, their straps coiled like lowercase letters. I asked whether my lawyer had arrived and was told she was en route, which is a sentence that has broken more backs than divorce, and I asked whether I could call Margot again and was told of course, as long as it didn't impede logistics, which is a word that sounds like help while doing harm. The transport lead unfolded a soft restraint with the tenderness one uses for a christening gown, and Dr. Keating entered behind them carrying an order for gentle pre-transport anxiolysis, his arithmetic corrected and his confidence newly ironed. For one strange, lucid second I saw us all from the ceiling, the widow, the son's agents, the earnest cops, the paper with its expensive seal, the needle that had rehearsed this kiss in the library, and I understood that they had built the stairway down into the earth and were asking me to call it a ramp. Vance put a hand on the back of the nearest chair and said my name in the tone of a man who hates the next sentence he has to say, and the transport lead reached for my wrist with fingers that would not remember me. I stood very still, memorizing every face in that bright, graceless room, and when the cap came off and the needle pricked the air between us again, inside a police station, under a camera, with the law's permission, I smiled so calmly the room blinked, because the door behind Linda had just opened to admit a woman in a navy suit carrying a file the size of a summer storm, and she said, in the voice that ends holidays and begins trials, that the court which signed that order had just been alerted to a conflict of interest bearing Daniel's handwriting. She was smaller than her file, which is how you know a woman is dangerous. The navy suit fit like a sentence with all the verbs in the right places. Her hair was the shade of practicality, and the first thing she did was set a stamped motion on the table so gently the paper seemed to apologize for having teeth. "Elena Markham, counsel," she said for the recorder, and her card made a small white flag on the gray metal. Then she turned the stamped page so Vance could read and tapped the seal with a manicured nail that had never once failed an argument. "Emergency stay granted by the duty judge," she said. "Temporary restraining order enjoining any sedation or transport of Ms. Harrison pending a competency hearing and evidentiary review." Linda tried to smile the smile of a woman whose train runs on time, but Elena's file opened like weather, screenshots of the proxy's watermark from Mercer and Vale, a printout of tonight's ex parte docket with the judge's disclosure footnote missing, and a copy of the judge's spouse's LinkedIn page wearing a Mercer and Vale title like a boutonniere. "Conflict on the record," Elena said, "and metadata on the guardianship PDF shows it originated from a device registered to one Linda Pax, not the clerk's office. Your portable scanner stamps its own signature in EXIF, dear." The word dear landed like a velvet hammer. Linda's mouth found a straight line and stayed on it. Vance read the order twice and then a third time as if he could pry intention from ink, and when he finally lifted his eyes they had the look men get when the ocean steps over their boots. "Transport is stayed," he said, voice flat with relief he wouldn't admit, and the older medic made a face that belonged to invoices while the younger one blessed the chain of command with a breath he thought nobody heard. Dr. Keating, suddenly a very small man with a very expensive watch, tried to pocket the syringe as if it were a pen, and Elena, without looking, said that body cam footage had already captured the lot number. If he left before swabbing his hands for residue, she would happily have him meet her again tomorrow as a named defendant. I have never loved paper quite the way I loved it in that moment, the way a stamped sentence can make men with straps step back from your wrists, and I felt the handcuffs lift like a bad idea politely reconsidering itself while Elena narrated for the record that I would submit to any neutral evaluation not chosen by my son or his vendors. "We'll also need to talk about this," she added, sliding my phone to the center of the table and lighting up the message that had arrived in my kitchen that afternoon like a rock through glass. Make sure she drinks the first toast. The doctor is ready for tomorrow. Elena had printed it large enough to shame, and she spoke its punctuation into the microphone so the commas would feel complicit. Daniel's throat worked. Ava's name flickered on Vance's clipboard from the ambulance notes. Benzodiazepine residue detected dermally, oral ingestion unlikely, and Delgado, who had not said much, said softly that a neighbor's video of the candle moment had already hit the cloud, and in it the doctor's hand looked exactly like a hand with a needle under a chandelier. Linda tried policy words, logistics, safety, standard, and Elena answered with statutes the way a pianist answers scales, precise, unhurried, pleased to be in the keys. If mere observation of confusion were enough to trigger involuntary custody, she said, we'd have to arrest half of Beacon Hill at any charity auction. You'll forgive the gallows humor. Vance signed an evidence form and handed the velvet case to Property, his mouth tight. Keating surrendered the syringe and glared at the floor as if it had betrayed him by being horizontal. I breathed, slow, deep, not because I was brave but because air is the only thing that can't be forged, and thought, absurdly, of the ledger in which I had once penciled grocery lists next to the numbers that made our life look tidy. The stay bought hours, not safety, and Elena used them like matches. She requested swabs of everyone's hands who had handled the case. She asked for the transport company's contract number with Sunrise Harbor. She placed a call on speaker to a clerk she addressed by first name and confirmed that the guardianship orders file Properties listed Linda's scanner as its midwife. And then she produced the neatest dagger of the evening, a photo of Daniel at a golf fundraiser last winter with the ex-part judge grinning on his left and a Mercer and Vail partner on his right, everyone holding a novelty check for a Safety Alliance gala whose logo matched the one printed at the bottom of the guardianship. Nobody is accusing anyone of quid pro quo, Elena said in the voice of a woman who has learned to carry gasoline in a teacup. We are merely pointing out that appearances occasionally commit felonies. Daniel tried to find his boyhood in his face and came up with a man who had mistaken entitlement for gravity. He told Vance that I had been paranoid, that grief had turned me into a collector of patterns, that this high-priced stranger did not know our family, and Elena let him have the rope and then tied a bow in its end. Paranoia doesn't watermark PDFs or preprint hospital intake bracelets, she said, tapping the evidence bag where the white band with my name lay like a peeled truth. Delgado's radio hissed with the station's heartbeat, and a dispatch about a missing juvenile from a reproductive clinic, the bolo that had brushed the party like a cold draft, returned with a new word attached, homicide. The syllables hung in the air like a smell, and every eye in the room found Dr. Keating as if pulled by weather. He opened his mouth and closed it, a man discovering that vocabulary has altitudes. Here is what happens next, Elena said, aligning her pages like a woman resetting a table after an inferior dinner. Ms. Harrison is released from custody into her own recognizance with a no-contact stipulation regarding Mr. and Mrs. Rowe. Evidence is preserved. All transports stand down. A neutral ER physician conducts independent blood panels. And at 9 a.m. I will be in front of a different judge with a different last name to ask why a private clinic's preferred ambulance and a family's preferred lawyer were allowed to turn a police station into a loading dock. She looked at Vance not as an enemy but as a man who has been drafted into someone else's thirst. Sergeant, your camera has already saved her once tonight. Don't let their paperwork undo your eyes. Vance pinched the bridge of his nose and signed the release with a pen that clicked like relief. Linda removed herself from the room with the dignity of an elevator closing. The medics muttered code numbers into their collarbones that sounded like retreat, and Keating asked for his counsel as if it were a glass of water in a drought. Elena leaned toward me and said we would walk out together, Not because the hall was dangerous, but because ceremony matters when you've just wrestled it away from thieves. I slid my ring back on. The emerald that remembers summers Robert promised were never really over, and stood very slowly, a woman whose bones have spent the evening remembering that they belong to her. We made it as far as the bullpen door before the building remembered who else lives in cities with money. The fire alarm tripped without shame, the kind of industrial bray that strips paint from manners, and the lights bucked twice as if the station had hit a pothole. Sprinklers did not deploy, which told me someone had chosen noise without water. Officers stood up in unison to be useful and then sat down in unison when their training caught up. A janitor's cart rolled past the glass with its trash bag tucked neatly like a black sail, and Elena's hand, cool and firm on my elbow, tightened in a way that said she recognized the badge clipped to the pocket of the man pushing it. Not police. Not city. Private, Matt finished, the exact shade of equipment you never notice unless you are paid to, and on the top tray of the cart, arranged with the modesty of a hotel amenity, lay a velvet case twin-sprung from the one property had sealed, and beside it a clear vial with a lot number 1 digit different from the syringe we had just logged. Vance's voice barked from behind us to hold in place, to clear the corridor, to let facilities handle the alarm. Delgado's hand came down on the push bar to keep the door from opening. Elena said, very softly, "They don't need doors, they need seconds." And the man with the cart looked up as if he'd heard his stage cue. The power flickered once more, long enough for the hallway cameras to blink their little red eyes, and in that breath of dark the cart kept moving straight for the interview wing and the evidence lockers beyond, steady as a tide. And I understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that whoever had planned my disappearance hadn't come to lose on paper. The alarm's howl flattened the corridor into a single bright intention, and the man with the cart didn't flinch so much as glide, eyes hooded, mouth set, pushing his janitor's kingdom as if he owned the geometry of the hallway. His badge said facilities in a font designed to be believed at 5 paces. The matte black radio on his belt had no department crest at all. Elena's fingers found my elbow and tightened, cool and precise, and I did the impolite thing old women are not supposed to do in government buildings. I stepped into the path of the cart and made him deal with me. "Young man," I said, because that phrase is a lever women of my generation keep in our sleeves, "your wheel is about to catch." He looked down. Instinct is older than training, and I kicked the triangular rubber doorstop under the front caster so the cart bucked an inch and stuttered. Delgado took the inch and became a wall. Vance's voice went hard as a locked drawer. "Sir, hands where I can see them," and the man smiled a small, patient smile that didn't belong to anyone who fixes leaks. He reached for the top tray with 2 fingers as delicate as a florist, aiming for the velvet case and the twin-numbered vial beside it. I was faster, because arthritis is not a synonym for slow, and swept both off the tray with my shawl as if clearing crumbs from a wedding table. Glass chimed, but did not break. Chain of custody bags appeared from Vance's jacket like handkerchiefs at a magic show. Elena narrated the lot number aloud as if speaking a spell. The man's face changed then, not fear, just an adjustment, like a chess player who accepts the lost piece and moves on, and he let the cart go, pivoted, and started for the interview wing with an easy trot that told me he had walked this floor before. He had a key, of course he did, the kind with a gray plastic head that opens rooms no one ever remembers signing for. Property's door thunked once against a half-turned lock as a clerk with a coffee mug bigger than his certainty tried to make his body into a policy. The man with the cart produced a little aerosol can from his pocket and drew a fog between himself and witness like a curtain being lowered in a cheap theater. Delgado hit the cloud anyway and caught him at the hips, the two of them skidding together into a bulletin board full of memos that had never imagined they would be scenery. Vance came in behind, shoulder first, and the radio on the man's belt barked a single word, clear, in a voice that belonged to someone who never stands in lines. Elena, who does not run unless pearls are at stake, walked through the haze and began listing items for the record: counterfeit badge with no city emboss, access key stamped with a private clinic's initials, gloves with adhesive residue dark as old honey. I stayed in the doorway, shawl swaddling the vial and case like a strange infant, and looked down at the work order clipped to the cart: Whitmore Facilities, after hours reset, signed in a hand I did not know and countersigned with 2 letters I did. Maybe it was maintenance ticket, maybe it was a woman who pronounces murder as modernization. Either way, the signature sat there with the calm of a stone in a shoe. The clerk, bless him, found his courage and jammed his own doorstop under property's threshold. Vance cuffed the saboteur, not gently now, and read him rights that sounded less like hospitality and more like gravity. The man answered none of it, his eyes sliding to the ceiling camera as if greeting an old friend. "It won't matter," he said softly, almost kindly, "the way you warn someone about black ice. By morning she's paper. You built a stay, we build a morning." We herded the evening back into the interview room because walls, however thin, are still better than hallways, and for 5 minutes bureaucracy remembered itself enough to write things down. Elena bagged my shawl as temporary evidence and produced a twin from her tote because women with steel files also carry cashmere redundancies. Vance logged the vial and the case under a number long enough to be believed. Delgado photographed scratches on the cart's tray where a velvet rectangle had lain moments ago, as if grooves could testify. The saboteur sat between 2 uniforms like a commuter waiting for the right stop, gaze untroubled, wrists quiet. He gave a name that would not stick to him and an address that belonged to a self-storage facility on the South Shore. When Vance mentioned Whitmore, the man's mouth did not move, but his pulse ticked in his neck like a second hand deciding about midnight. "Why destroy evidence in a police station?" Elena asked, not expecting an answer and receiving, almost, one anyway. "You're still thinking in rooms," he murmured. "We think in routes." Vance's radio crackled then with the kind of dispatch that arranges faces. The ambulance carrying Ava had not gone to the neutral ER Elena had named. A hospitalist had diverted her for continuity of care to Sunrise Harbor, where the paperwork already had a bed warmed for me. "Guardianship order faxed directly to intake," the voice added, and I watched Sergeant Vance swallow something that did not want to be swallowed. Elena's jaw set, neat and mathematical. "We file an injunction before dawn," she said, "and we put eyes on that building now." Keating's counsel had just arrived. Someone added over the chatter, a Ms. Torres from Mercer and Vale, requesting her client forthwith. The room's temperature dropped without touching the thermostat. She had the talent of looking ordinary in expensive light, which is the only way you run a factory inside a family without anyone calling it smoke. "Good evening, Sergeant," she said, as if arriving for a board meeting that had overrun its dessert, and the card she placed on the table carried a name I had already met in ink: Miranda Torres, partner. She did not look at me first. Predators know better than to greet the deer before the hounds. "My client will not be making any statements tonight," she told Vance, voice neutral enough to pass a breathalyzer, "and we will need a full chain of custody review on whatever theatrical props have just found their way into your evidence locker." Elena's smile showed the smallest possible number of teeth. "Ah," she said, "the magician asks to inventory the rabbits." Miranda turned her head then, finally, and gave me the professional warmth of a dentist who has already decided on extraction. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, pronouncing it with care, "I'm relieved to see you well. Sunrise Harbor had a room prepared in case your recovery required comfort." I felt something old in me stand up from a chair very slowly. "Comfort," I said, "appears to travel with men who carry straps." She glanced at the saboteur without letting her eyes land on him and patted the air with 2 fingers, a little metronome of don't. "Sergeant," she went on, I'm also obliged to inform you that Sunrise Harbor is under a temporary security lockdown due to a reported threat. Building access is restricted to authorized medical personnel and counsel." Elena laughed once, a sound like a glass finding the exact place on a shelf. "A threat," she repeated, arriving precisely when outside eyes might be inconvenient. "How novel." Vance's radio confirmed it a beat later. "Code black at Sunrise Harbor, facility lockdown, no incoming except ambulance bay." The saboteur smiled, that small, patient smile again, the kind you wear when your weather report has been correct all week. Miranda gathered her portfolio with the calm of a woman tidying a kitchen someone else will clean. "You have my card," she said to Vance. "Please advise me the moment you are ready to release my client. There appears to have been confusion at your party tonight." She let the words sit there, the claws from the proxy made flesh, and as she turned to go she laid a single sheet from her folder on the table where I could see it without touching, an intake form bearing my name, tomorrow's date, and a line reserved for a physician's observation. It was blank except for one neat word in fountain pen blue, in a hand I now knew as well as my own. "Confused." The word on the intake form, "confused," sat there in fountain pen blue like a moth pinned for display, and something practical and very old in me decided that if they wanted confusion I would give them clarity until it squeaked. Elena slipped the form into a sleeve as if tucking a blade out of sight and began dialing in a voice that made clerks remember their training. Within minutes she had a second stay from a judge whose spouse did not golf with my son, a preservation order for every document bearing my name, and a directive that any sedation without my written consent would constitute battery under state law. Vance signed my release with a pen that clicked like a thank you he refused to say aloud, assigned Delgado to us, and told property to copy the flash drive 3 times and upload to a city server even if the power decides to be dramatic. On the way out I handed Elena the little thumb drive I'd hidden in my shawl back at the house, the one labeled backups, photos and logs, and watched her eyebrows rise the way a seam rises under a good tailor, not showy, just promise. "Routes," she said, remembering the saboteur's quiet philosophy, and texted 3 people at once: the Attorney General's Elder Justice Unit, a reporter who doesn't use adjectives, and a judge's clerk whose ringtone was blessedly boring. Outside, the night had the brittle shine cities where when it's almost morning and lies are tired. I climbed into the back of the cruiser without help because I wanted the memory of it. And as we rolled through empty lights I thought about the first time Daniel let go of my hand at a crosswalk and how I had pretended not to notice so he could believe he'd done it himself. Sunrise Harbor pretended to be a hotel that read medical textbooks for fun, curved glass, tasteful trees and planters, a lobby that smelled like disinfected citrus and money. Private security met us with smiles that had lamination beneath them and announced a code black that restricted access to authorized personnel and counsel, which would have been funny if it hadn't been designed to be lethal. Elena served the ink like a meal: emergency stay, preservation order, notarized threat of contempt, while Vance translated it into consonants security guards understand. And when a supervisor tried the word policy on him, he answered with obstruction and 3 statute numbers that traveled well through glass. We moved in as a small procession: lawyer, widow, sergeant, young officer carrying a body-worn camera like a lantern, and the building did what buildings do when their secrets get company. It tried to reroute us with carpeting. The admissions desk, all soft edges and spa fonts, offered comfort suites. Behind the desk, on a shelf too neat to be honest, stood a label printer whispering plastic bracelets with names it hadn't earned. I saw my own on top of the stack, the band's white curved into a question mark. A nurse with a good face and bad orders took one look at Elena's paper and found enough conscience to misplace us down a corridor that ended not in wellness but in a door labeled transition, and even the font knew what it meant. On a side table waited a standard velvet case and a silver tray with a single syringe nested like cutlery. The chart on the bed named me in pre-printed capitals and listed pre-transport anxiolysis as if calm were something you could inject into a problem you'd invented. Chain of custody? Elena asked the air. The air pretended not to hear. They were waiting in the glass-walled family room like actors who know the third act is where the audience earns its ticket. Linda with her portable scanner, Dr. Keating with his watch and clean hands, two administrators with clipboards, and, of course, Miranda Torres in navy, reading a document as if it were an appetizer. Daniel stood beside her with the posture of a man trying to look taller than consequences, eyes red in the way people think sells sincerity. Beyond the glass a gurney was already dressed for me, fresh sheet, soft restraints coiled like punctuation, a monitor blinking my name as if the room had decided to practice saying it without me. Ava lay on a bed farther in, pale but breathing, a nasal cannula softening her face into a child's, and 4 bag labeled with a benzodiazepine brand I can pronounce because magazines used to assume wives read labels while husbands read markets. Elena put the stay where the glass could see it and spoke evenly to the room. Any touch of needle to skin would be battery. Any movement of paper through that scanner would be spoliation. Any step toward me without consent would be logged on a camera already beloved by judges and enemies. Miranda smiled the way women smile when they've sold the furniture twice and the bank calls it innovation. She lifted a hand and, as if on cue, an interior alarm throbbed softly, security theater, not sprinklers, locking sections of the ward behind descending fire doors that made the corridor into a set of small certainties. Vance swore, not at anyone but at the idea of it, and pushed through the first door before it fully seated. Delgado held the second with his shoulder in a way that would bruise beautifully later. Linda raised the scanner like a priest raises bread and murmured something about protocol. Keating picked up the syringe by the barrel, the way men pick up arguments they prefer you not to see. Daniel opened his mouth to say mom in that plaintive key children use when they want forgiveness to outrun arithmetic, and I turned my head toward him with the kind of stillness that once made him stop throwing sand at the playground. "You brought me here," I said, polite as ice. The inner door side shut behind us with the sound of a signature. The lock answered. And somewhere on the far side of the glass, a nurse who had not been born when I learned to be dangerous lifted a tray, stepped toward my arm as if approaching a docile animal, and said my name in the tone people use right before they test whether the weather belongs to them. The nurse's fingers were steady in that professional way that tells you the shaking has been outsourced to someone else. She smiled with the soft eyes of a person taught to apologize for orders and said my name again as the syringe nosed toward the paper gown. I did the one impolite thing that still works on men with pens and doors with locks. I spoke to the woman actually holding the needle. I read her badge, Marisol Vega, RN, and told her briskly that I would be filing a sworn statement naming her personally if that needle touched skin without consent. And then I listed my allergy, my right under the stay Elena had served, and my request for the exact dosage and lot number while a camera watched and a sergeant wrote the time. Her mouth pressed thin at the word personally, not because she was cruel but because she had a mortgage, and I saw the calculation ripple across her face the way a breeze lifts a sheet on a line. Marisol, I said, softer now, grandmother to nurse, woman to woman. This isn't medicine, it's paperwork with a plunger. Her breath hitched, the needle paused, a small punctuation mark uncertain which sentence it belonged to, and behind the glass Miranda's hand flicked once in irritation, the way people swat flies when they don't plan to leave fruit out again. Elena did not raise her voice, she widened it. She recited the stay's language in a cadence built for court reporters and judges with headaches, named the statutes about battery and false imprisonment, and informed the room that a request for a criminal warrant was already flashing on a magistrate's phone with enough attachments to bruise the cloud. Vance stepped between me and the tray with a body that had finally picked a side. Delgado filmed the syringe so close the lot number turned into geography. Daniel tried for tenderness, the counterfeit kind that wilts under fluorescence, telling me I was frightened and tired and everyone here loved me. Keating tried for science and failed basic arithmetic again by claiming a dosage that did not exist on the label in his own hand. Linda lifted the scanner like a relic and moved toward the stack of forms. Elena touched the glass with a fingernail, quick as a metronome, and said the word spoliation in the register women use when they are done baking for other people's parties. Somewhere deeper in the ward, a door sighed and locked. The monitor by the empty bed blinked my name like a promise the room had decided to keep without me, and then a sound none of them had rehearsed arrived in the corridor. A measured chorus of shoes that belong to people who don't ask for permission to be counted. They came in dark jackets with small letters that didn't care about chandeliers, Attorney General's Elder Justice Unit, plus 2 state troopers who wore their hats like punctuation, with a warrant thick enough to stun an ox. The lead investigator, a woman whose bun had its own opinions, read the first page aloud to the camera as if the room might need a bedtime story. Search and seizure for records related to involuntary detention, fraudulent capacity determinations, and unlawful chemical restraint, including but not limited to devices, scanners, admission bans, and controlled substances, probable cause supported by tonight's recordings, the guardianship metadata, and a Bolo update tying Whitmore to a missing minor whose case had just changed color from gray to blood. Miranda didn't blink, women like her practice not blinking. She asked for a copy, she asked for reasonable scope, she asked, with exquisite neutrality, whether counsel could remain with clients during collection. Elena answered that the word clients would be a generous fiction by morning, and Vance, God bless him, added that everybody's hands would be swabbed before anyone left the room, including the partner who liked to pronounce confusion as diagnosis. Marisol lowered the syringe into its cradle with the gentleness of someone setting down a bird that had decided to live somewhere else. I need to check on another patient, she murmured, and stepped back in a small circle that looked a lot like a conscience clearing itself a seat. Ava moaned then, a thin ribbon of sound, and for a gaudy instant Daniel looked like a boy again, the one who once scraped his knees and came running to a woman he trusted. He moved toward the bed and then saw the trooper's hand shift, remembered which narrative he had purchased, and stopped. "She'll tell you," he said toward the camera, voice raw enough to make one honest memory bruise in my chest. "She'll say I didn't know." Miranda cut him a glance that could sand a table and redirected her smile to the warrant, but the room was already migrating toward a different center of gravity. The troopers opened the first cabinet and found velvet cases nested like matryoshka lies. The AG investigator peeled a label off the bracelet printer and matched the serial to the band in the bag property had sealed at the station. Delgado announced the saboteur from the precinct was already in a holding cell writing down procedures with an efficiency that smelled like a plea deal. Elena opened my flash drive, the one labeled backups, and the screen filled with their own handwriting, capacity declaration templates, continuity plan checklists, a calendar with an entry at tonight's hour labeled candle moment, and a line in Miranda's hand, sunrise intake triggered by observation. Confused. I wish I could tell you I felt triumph, that Golden Rush men write into biographies when the villain trips on his cape. What I felt was older and plainer, like finding your kitchen after a storm and realizing the roof is still there because you hammered it yourself. Vance read Miranda her rights. Keating tried to leave with the syringe and discovered gravity is bilingual. Linda hugged her scanner the way a child clutches a toy she knows she has already outgrown, then put it on the table when a trooper raised one eyebrow. Daniel sagged against the glass not because he had been pushed but because a man cannot hold his shape when the lie he's married collapses in his arms. Ava opened her eyes and found the camera and said my name like a confession, then wept into the cannula in a way that made it hard to remember the terrace. The room breathed, which is to say the room finally stopped pretending it could hold its breath forever. Paperwork multiplied the way paper does when it is finally behaving. Bracelets were bagged, alarms were silenced with keys instead of lies, and by the time Dawn remembered where Boston is, Miranda Torres was in cuffs that didn't care about Navy. Dr. Keating was finding out how chain of custody tastes when you've mocked it. Linda was asking a public defender what EXIF means, and my son was sitting in a plastic chair explaining to a woman with a clipboard what happens to boys who think signatures are weather. The legal part did not make for good television, which is why justice rarely trends. There were hearings full of air conditioning and paper and men who liked their pens. There were motions that sounded like lullabies and orders that felt like knuckles. There were days when I ate a granola bar in a hallway while Elena turned knives into statutes. The guardianship was vacated, the proxies voided, the admission protocols at Sunrise Harbor rewritten by people who finally learned what a witness is for. The AG's office folded Whitmore into a case name with vowels and numbered counts, and that missing girl became a human being in filings that made grown clerks blow their noses. Daniel took a deal that traded part of his future for all of his cowardice. Ava cooperated and discovered the precise wattage of the word accessory. Keating's license learned a new verb. Miranda tried to bargain with names and discovered the currency had changed while she was blinking. I went home, not to the old house, which smells of ghosts and lilies, but to the sturdy condo with the loud kettle and the ledger that still balances when you treat numbers like truth. I watered the rosemary Robert planted in a broken tea tin on our third summer, opened the window so the honest city noise could argue with the sparrows, and sat down to write this, because panic is just memory that needs a chair. If you have listened this far, you already know the moral, though I have learned that morals are like bread, good ones must be made again every morning. Families are not contracts. Paper is not love. Convenience is a religion that eats its saints. The body remembers who touched it gently and who tried to make signatures out of veins. I am 62, which is an age that makes waiters call you dear and men with scanners call you confused, and I am here to remind you that confused is a word that should be reserved for people who look at a grandmother and see only a ledger. The house is quieter now, gentler, patient with the kettle and the mending basket and the photographs that have learned to stop lying. Some evenings I walk past the old street and count the windows, and the lamplight still leans in as if it wants to overhear secrets, but it hears only a woman breathing the ordinary air she fought for. And when the mailman brings an envelope with my son's handwriting on it, apologies that always run out of ink before they run out of need, I set it beside the rosemary and let it rest there until it stops pretending it's anything more than paper. This morning another letter arrived with no return address at all. Inside was a single photo of a clinic hallway and 2 initials in blue fountain pen at the bottom, empty, and beneath them one word that has learned not to frighten me. Soon.